A warm welcome to all our audience and everybody who's watching, and to our speaker as well as our moderator for the next installment of the Learning Curve webinar. We really appreciate your coming here at this time and joining us. And today we are expecting a very animated conversation on well-being from our previous issue, nurturing well-being in school. It's my great privilege and pleasure to introduce both our speaker and moderator. Our speaker today, our guest today, is Keerthana Paulraj, who is an educator, mindfulness practitioner, and an advocate of socio-emotional learning. She has an MA in education from Azim Premji University and has almost 3 years experience in teaching middle and high school students and developing curricula. Her interests are understanding the nuances of mental health and promoting well-being practices, thereby hoping to build safer, more equitable and compassionate learning spaces. She is currently curating well-being workshops as part of her organization, Center for Mindful Presence in Bangalore. Welcome to this, Keerthana. Actually, our moderator needs no introduction. She is very well known to all of us. But for those who are new to this, let me have the pleasure of introducing Nimrat Kaur, who's been with the Azim Premji Foundation for more than a decade and is currently part of the School of Continuing Education and the University Resource Center, Azim Premji University, where she contributes to professional development programs. Nimrat has been working primarily in the space of education policy, teacher education, and assessment, and has also contributed to teacher education curricula and material development. Welcome to our program, Nimrat. Thank you very much, both of you, for being with us today. Now, over to both of you for a very interesting discussion. And I don't need to remind the audience, I think, that if you have questions, please put them in the comment box and we will try to answer as many as we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prema. And Keerthana, it is indeed a privilege to be speaking to you after reading your article. I really appreciated the way it brought out the complexity in the work of the teacher, the demands made on them by various stakeholders, as well as their concerns, particularly related to service conditions and the kind of support that they receive both within the school and the ecosystem surrounding the school. It's interesting that you position well-being in all its dimensions as a means to teachers' physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional health, and connect this to teachers' emotional intelligence. Um, and you talk about how this emotional intelligence actually helps in improving students' learning outcomes and helps them learn better. Could you share some examples of emotional intelligence in the context of the teacher's work and how it influences their practice?
Thank you, Prema, for that introduction, and thank you, Nimrat, for that question. Um, yeah, so just as my article talks about teacher well-being in all its dimensions, I think each of these aspects of health itself, right, which you mentioned, which is physical, emotional, spiritual health, add up to a teacher's degree of emotional intelligence. And when you ask for examples, I think we can look at it as multiple dimensions. It is, if you start off with the classroom, it is as basic as a teacher being able to recognize a child's need in the classroom and then being able to introduce a pedagogic tool to enable the child to learn better then, right? Emotional intelligence may also look like a teacher's ability to recognize their own limitations or health requirements or needs and then pay attention to it. During my stint as a teacher, I did have a colleague who was going through some health issues, and it was her emotional intelligence that enabled her to see that she needed support, and she was able to request one of us who were less stressed to step in along with her to help her support her classroom teaching learning process, right? Emotional intelligence would also look like knowing that you're a human being who's allowed to make mistakes in a classroom, and to just sort of step back, reflect, and see how you want to play it. A teacher sometimes may be aware of how her class is progressing, but when she sort of steps back at the end of a day, look and say, how can I do something better? That is also a sign of emotional intelligence, right? And in all of this, emotional intelligence is also knowing that here's where I have a role to play, and here's where I need the rest of the school to support me. Sometimes you can't stretch yourself thin trying to bring all the pieces of the puzzle together. And so coming to sort of radically accept that is also then a sign of being emotionally intelligent. Yeah.
Uh, that's very interesting, Keerthana, because the way I hear it, emotional intelligence is not just about a teacher's personal or um, uh, in the context of the individual or the classroom and its happenings, but also in terms of how it helps the teacher actually reflect on her practice and improve um, the conditions in which learning takes place, really. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
That is also very interesting because, which brings me to my next question, Kirtana. Um, I was just thinking while I was reading the article that we're talking about the teaching profession, and you've gotten this very interesting dimension, which is not something really that, like uh, you were discussing just before we started the webinar, is not something that's really in the discourse around teachers or even individuals in our country, really. And we also think of teaching as a profession. And among other things, the one aspect of the profession is the code of ethical conduct. And you also focus on ethics of teaching in your article. To my mind, this is an area which has multiple kind of opinions around it. There is one view that the personal values and the private behavior of a teacher are really their own business, and the code of ethics of a teacher should be limited to basically the professional part of things, the behavior and the code of conduct in the school. Whereas other people speak of the teacher being a role model and to the entire community, and therefore their personal and private beliefs and their private personal behavior outside the school in the classroom are also relevant. So I was just wondering what you had in mind when you spoke of ethics and how you see it being operationalized in a teacher's practice. There are some other questions related to this, but if you could respond to this first.
Sure. Um, I think it's interesting that you bring up this aspect of ethical conduct, right? Because, like I've mentioned in my previous response as well, when a teacher enters a classroom, um, they they are uh, at the center of every activity that occurs there, and the child is watching them, modeling them. There's a great sense of a control almost that a teacher has in that situation in terms of impacting the child's ideas about just just very very simple basic things, also by virtue of how much time then children spend in a school itself. And so I think that's also deeply tied to how we perceive teaching as a profession itself, which is that it's like I've mentioned in my article, we see it as close to that of a job of a social worker, which is not anything simple either. But there is this overall perception that teaching is a simple job, which it isn't. It's a complex practice which has the coming together of not just subject knowledge, but also just different pedagogic tools, this aspect of ethical conduct that you brought in. And so when we treat teaching as a profession, we're able to see a teacher as a professional. Then we're able to sort of discern and say that they're also human beings who are allowed to exist outside of their role and identity as a teacher. And so then we're also able to see that. See how their well-being matters, right? Or see how other parts of their life exist. uh, does that answer some part of your question?
Yeah, yeah. In fact, what you said just takes me back to something an example you mentioned in your article, in which a teacher says that, I'm constantly surrounded by children. And the automatic, idea that comes into your mind is, oh, she's pleased that she's surrounded by teachers. But you were actually talking about the need for space, the need for actually finding some time to rest, and you give certain examples of how this can be done within the school. So it's interesting that you see that while being in a kind of a nurturing, caring kind of a role, the teacher still needs to be cared for and nurtured in a sense, herself or himself.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, yeah. And I was also just wondering, Keerthana, with your experience and your reflections on this whole aspect, um, how is this ethical conduct connected to the teacher's well-being? And is it something that's unspoken, or is there some kind of a formal understanding between people within a school? How much of it is dependent on individuals? Can it be, in a sense, institutionalized, become a part of school processes?
Right. um, so it is possible to I will start with the last question, which is it possible to institutionalize these ideas of caring or teachers' well being itself? And I think it is possible to do that with an understanding that that very system is built for a teacher. I think there's an example I give in the article as well, which is a policy of leave for teachers. And there was a case of a teacher who had to go on maternity leave, and how they were able to extend that leave policy to sort of accommodate her health needs as well. And so if we can or say, even for example, the fact that if we can bring in a supplementary leave policy which allows teachers with, say, mental health issues, or for female teachers to take period leave if that's necessary, or if anybody with any other kind of disability requires a leave, right? Just to sort of introduce those things would be in some sense an institutional policy, right? But when we look at an individual's role, I think for each of us to just understand why well-being matters itself, right? Just the fact that this is not just a crisis in the teacher community, but in society at large, right? Wherein we lack a desire or complete understanding of well-being itself, and there's just this need to run, to do more than our bodies can or are ready to do, and just to sort of keep up with what capitalism then just sort of demands of us as a society. Um, the central idea is to sort of pause and say, what does well-being mean to me, and what can I do in my circumstances to take better care of myself so that I can arrive better for the work that I do as a teacher. And that would also then involve knowing what steps you can take and what support you can ask for, what resources you need, so to just sort of develop that kind of awareness as well. And central to all of this is that a teacher's work deeply impacts a child, and there is a sense of morality in that. There is an ethic in that. And if a teacher is burnt out, dissatisfied, angry, and that's the person walking into a classroom, uh, then it is almost immoral as to what would happen to that child by virtue of such a stressed out teacher walking into the classroom. Um, yeah, and that's
Yeah,
how I see it.
yes, that makes a lot of sense, the way you put it. And in your article, you've emphasized a couple of times, if I'm correct, if I remember correctly, the need for teachers to articulate, which is something you just mentioned right now, for teachers to articulate their needs. So then it just kind of creates this kind of confusion in my head, in the sense that teachers have their needs which are deeply personal and something that ideally should be taken care of at the level of the school. But at the same time, there is this whole ecosystem surrounding the teacher. For example, leave. Now, as we know in our school systems, we are a stickler for rules, right? So, to be able to participate in a school discipline, there should be teacher leave, which is not within the policy, laid down by the district or the state, would be something unusual. So of course you talk about this informal culture of care, and you give certain examples also of how, and you've mentioned them also, how within the school small little interventions can help make a teacher's state of well-being, improve a teacher's state of well-being to some extent. But do you think that a centralized kind of a code is needed, or do you think there should be something that finds its way into pre and in service curricula or processes around teacher? You mentioned the policy, of course, but we know that there is this whole gap between policy and implementation until there's a certain amount of understanding and sensitization. So, how do you see it? Do you see it as something that's taken care of at the level of policy, where a code of ethics, not only for teachers but also for all the people around them, to be respectful of teachers, to be able to cater to their needs, etc., make small adjustments. So, or do you see it something that's entirely left at the level of the school?
Right. So I do see that a centralized policy would be necessary, just as the national curricular framework for teacher education emphasizes, right? Which says that teaching is a profession where teachers are supposed to be respected as adults and all of that, right? But what needs to be translated is that into action. We do see that, for example, in the NCF, they do talk about the importance of gender sensitization. And that got implemented in our textbooks. And then through teacher training workshops, we're trying to teach teachers how to sort of then implement that. So, in a similar sense, if these things are being introduced and spoken about in policies, then we need to sort of see what it looks like to bring it down and implement it at a ground level. And so when I see the need for immediate change, I think at the level of schools, that's where it's most important. It's important for school leaders to sort of step up, bodies that revolve around schools, immediate organizations to see what interventions can be done. But at the meanwhile, when you think about it, if higher authorities are going to start thinking about teacher well-being, the care of our teachers, then that is revolutionary in its own sense, and that's imperative and necessary at the times we live in. So I see it as the coming together of the two, for sure. But just as a critical intervention, I think we must start at the school level itself.
That makes a lot of sense because it has to be immediate. You can't wait. And can you illustrate some of these critical interventions that can happen at the level of the school? You mentioned a few examples in your article, but if you could just kind of bring them together for us, the small examples of how what can be done at the level of the school.
Right. So I think if a school leader or people of authority in a school are carrying within them an intention to promote their teachers' as well-being, and if they have the time, space, and resources, it may help to start off by having conversations with teachers itself to sort of ask them, what are your needs, right? What would you need to be able to teach well in a classroom? And then to sort of look into their resources, support system to see how much of that can be implemented immediately. But aside from that, just say if you're having a meeting, at the start of every meeting, can you just go around and ask the teachers how they're feeling, how their week has been? Was there a moment in their classroom that they really appreciated? Was there something that they struggled with, right? just to sort of humanize these meetings in some sense, just to start off. And also then maybe creating some space in these meetings for reflections itself, right? Maybe the question that I had mentioned previously itself, right? Like, is there something that you were struggling with? And if they were, can they share it with that group of teachers? Is there some sort of suggestion that can come around from that room of teachers if they're also teaching that same bunch of children, right? Just simple things like that to just kickstart that process of having more humanized conversations in some sense, but also say setting up communication guidelines, right? Not sending information to teachers at like 10 o'clock in the night unless it's an emergency, making sure that emails are not sent early in the morning, right? Just sort of setting guidelines around that may help to sort of also help teachers know that they respect my time outside of the school, and that yeah, I'm seen as this person who has a life outside being a teacher, right? Also maybe with professional development, you could begin by asking teachers, what kind of professional development workshops do you need, or do you actually want to attend this? We could also perhaps look at something like creating more fun professional development things, right? Maybe screening a movie at a teachers meeting, maybe having a storybook that they can discuss together, um, having something like post-its that they can put up on the wall with something that they've learned that week in the classroom for the other teachers to look and learn, right? Just maybe those are some things we can start off with, and we don't have to do all of this at once, but just as I think James Clear said, start small if you have to, but just start somewhere, start small, but start. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Keerthana. Prema, I can see some questions. Would you like? Do you think we should take them up now? You're on mute, Prema.
Here's a question from Madhu, along with a comment from her. She says, life not in just terms and words, but in actual as allocations and changes that need to be made to the day-to-day function. How is the private sector with regard to regarding teachers as individuals? That's a question from Madhu, who's talking about the private sector as against government schools, I think.
So, just from my own experiences, from stories I've heard from teacher friends in different schools, I don't think there is just one kind of response to teachers as human beings. I think schools that are more high-end international in some spaces do tend to hold teacher well-being to some extent. But in other cases, they are paying them really well, but still exploiting them, making them work 6 days a week for 10 hours because they're being paid well. In some other cases, there are private low-fee schools which don't pay them well and still are just spending long hours getting them to teach, do administrative work. Also, because there's the pressure of bringing in more students because the fees is low, there is also that sort of pressure. So, just in a large space, and even in the alternate school space, teachers are stretched thin. They're not necessarily paid well, and the assumption is that because they're alternate, to some extent, they would take into consideration teacher well-being. But even on that front, children are placed at the center of it, and then teachers are sort of ignored in that process. So, to answer your question, Matu, I don't think the private sector's doing anything very differently. Of course, there are anomalies here and there, but yeah, we're still in the dark there.
Teacher education program which can have an impact in bringing about a change in the system? That's the first question. If you answer that, then I'll tell you what the second question is from
Sure.
her.
This is the question from Danya, right?
One, the first question. She's got another
Okay.
question as well.
Okay, okay. I think that would really help, Tanya, because two of my friends from APU who've started an organization called Sahapadi, which is a center for dialogic learning, wherein they're doing dialogue-based pedagogic workshops with pre-service teachers. And one of the things that they reflected on was how they had to bring in elements of SEL into the classroom with the pre-service teachers, because that was the way they could express themselves, create safe spaces to then move on to understand a little more about conflict resolution and dialogue itself. So yes, definitely adding a course on social emotional learning will help teachers reflect on themselves and yeah, and understand children's psychology in some sense also then better.
The second question from Dhanya is usually a teacher finds time as a constraint. Teachers find time as a constraint in his or her daily life. With this in mind, can you suggest ways in which a teacher can take time for self reflection as a daily practice? That's very interesting.
Yeah, so I think just before we went live, I was telling Prema one of the things that teachers face is this constraint with regard to time itself, to be able to take some time out to do the things uh, that will nurture you, right? And so one of the things that we could possibly try is to not want to set, say, a 30 or a 45 minutes, but just to say, I want to set aside 5 minutes to reflect, or I want to set aside 10 minutes to reflect, right? And if we can attach this, say, with an existing exercise. So every every night when I brush, I will brush and then sit for 5 minutes with my journal. Or when I wake up every morning, you can keep a book by your bedside, which you can like immediately write with. If you have kids at home, when they're having a homework time, you could maybe sit with them when they are doing their homework and you could spend that time reflecting as well. Or if there is another adult at home who you can sort of build a peer practice with, that is another possibility. If there's another teacher who holds a similar intention to do a daily practice, can you try and find 10 minutes during school hours to do this together? Or is there like a call that you can set up where you can just sit across the screen and quietly do some daily writing? Right? But again, starting small is key. Just say, I'm going to spend 5 minutes doing it and then slowly building it. And in that process, forgiving yourself, right? Practicing a lot of self-compassion when you can't arrive at the practice, and just make saying, I will start every time I stop or there's a break with it. Yeah, that's how I see it. I hope that helps, Tanya.
Um, Here I have a small question. How,
Yes.
when you say self-compassion, exactly what is that? Because these are terms that a lot of our teachers don't really know, though they've heard it. So
Right.
maybe you could explain to us, because the teachers who are listening would like to know. I'm sure. I mean, I myself was a teacher. I am a teacher for a long time. What is
Right.
exactly self-compassion?
Right. So this person called Kristen Neff beautifully lists three aspects that are a part of self-compassion, which is having practicing mindfulness, practicing loving kindness towards the self, and remembering your shared humanity. So the idea of practicing self-compassion is to be able to basically look at yourself however you are and offer yourself a few words of love, just as you would to a loved one who may be going through something, right? It may be as simple as using phrases or words that you would use with them itself. You can use words like, hi love, I see you, I know you're hurt, I know you're tired, and it's okay to feel this way. To sort of accept and acknowledge that you are having this experience. It may include you having made a mistake, right? To say, I'm sorry that you made that mistake and it's okay, and I see you and what can be learned from it. And so that element of mindfulness is important in it, so that we stay in that moment and we don't start getting lost in thoughts about it or spiraling or ruminating over it. And then finally remembering that we live with other human beings, which means that this happens to everybody else as well. And it's a part of the shared human experience to feel exhausted, to feel sad, to experience adversity, to live in uncertainty, right? And so that's what I mean by self compassion, which is to be able to just give yourself some. Just some holding, some love, some kindness. Yeah.
There's a comment from Hargul Sarwal who says, I think this aspect can really be of great help for pupil teachers during internship. I think we all agree with that.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. Um, I think that would also create the space to confront our own like educational system that we've been a part of, right? So many teachers are teachers who've been taught by teachers who've not uh, done any of these things with them, and so just by virtue of that, they're carrying that sort of intergenerational trauma, and so the point is to sort of pause, reflect, and see how you can change some of those things about yourself, and then move ahead, yeah, to create a more positive impact.
More questions from Hargun Sarwal, who's asking, how can SEL help in bringing the best out of students?
Right.
Yeah.
So emotions are a big part of our human experience, so are thoughts, right? And the idea of social emotional learning is to sort of try and help to find that balance between our ability to think rationally and be emotional. And so, say if we're able to hold a sharing circle for students where they're able to process some emotions, where they're able to even consider the possibility of different emotions, um, and and then also learn how to hold space for these emotions. The idea is to be able to feel them, but not to get lost in these things, right? Because things are constantly changing even within us. Like I may feel happy when I see a question, I may feel anxious when I read another question. And the idea is to not get caught onto one thing, but to keep up with it. And so, in SEL, the idea is to teach children exercises, to do exercises with children to help them be sort of mindful, to be open to what's coming, and to deal with it, to be resilient in the face of it. So, how I see it is that SEL will help children become more awake, be more accepting of themselves, and thereafter, as a result of all of this, then also help them in the academic sense or their extracurricular sense, whatever their interests be, to even be able to recognize that is how I see it, Argun.
So,
For the
yeah.
present, the questions have stopped coming. So, shall we go on with your
Yes,
question?
yes, absolutely. So I found that very, very interesting, Keerthana, and I'm so happy that the questions brought out a lot of interesting and very different kind of ideas. So that was very enjoyable for me. I was just thinking of two things that you said. One was about the fact that teachers are expected to do in their classrooms what they have never experienced themselves.
Right,
Forget about school, even in pre-service they don't get the opportunity to actually experience the kind of classroom that our curriculum frameworks etc expect
right,
from teachers to help create. And the other thing you mentioned was peer practice. So it's interesting that I'm just wondering, bringing together a set of teachers, some who have these new ideas, some who've been in the system for a long time, have never had the opportunity maybe of kind of thinking about different ways of doing things. So, and then I think about what you say in your article about group mentoring and one-on-one mentoring. Is peer practice something like that? And I think it's more of a two-way process, right? Between teachers, it's not as if one is in a kind of a position to tell and the other one to receive. How do you see it playing out?
right. Um, I'm sorry. So I lost you at the initial bit where you mentioned about peer practice mentorship, but right before that, there was something that you had
Yeah,
mentioned.
just that I was quoting you about teachers not being able to experience
Experience, right?
what they are actually expected to do in their classrooms.
Right,
And there are some teachers in the system who've been there for a long time who
right,
might not even have, been acquainted with these ideas.
right,
So I was thinking of that in the context of peer practice.
right. Uh, Thank you, Nimrat. So, um, the the context of mentorship in the case of one-on-one would ideally be where one person is largely giving offering guidance to the other person, wherein, say, like the example I had mentioned in the article itself, which was how this person was a novice teacher. They were really overwhelmed in the classroom, but in the presence of a mentor, they were able to process all of that and understand different pedagogic tools that they could take back. And this mentor was a much senior teacher who's been teaching that particular age group for decades now. But in the case of a group mentorship, it would be more of a peer practice, like you mentioned, wherein it would be the coming together of the new and the old, um, but everybody coming in with an openness to learn and be willing to hear and be heard, right? So, say if there is a teacher who's been around for several years but is struggling with one particular student in a classroom, whereas a novice teacher seems to have been able to crack it, a conversation between them, even in a group meeting, would enable for conversation, for learning to happen in that sense. So the idea is for the teachers to also have a sort of connection, belongingness together, to trust that the other person has my best intentions in their mind when they're offering me something, and to not be offended by it in some sense. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Prema, I see some more questions.
Yes. Dhanya is again asking, do we have data that gives us an idea of the current state of well-being among teachers? If not, can such surveys be done? Why is there a delay to conduct such studies? That's one question. There's another from Pratiksha, but if you answer this, I will let you know the second one.
Sure. So I'm not very sure about data, Danya. I will look that up and see if I can give you that information. But can such surveys be done? Definitely can be done. It will give us a sense of just how, and all of these surveys always tell us how dissatisfied teachers are, how burnt out they are, how likely are they to leave the profession. But none of these surveys are telling us if we're doing something right and if that's working and if we can promote that. So it will be interesting for us to set up a survey to do that as well. Why is there a delay to conduct such studies? It's possible that we don't have this intention as something that we're holding as critical in our minds. We're still, I think, caught up in trying to get operational things in place. But I don't want to sound so grim as well, because I do know that there's lots of work being done by different people in their own measure to sort of not just understand these things, but also to work on the field. So, yeah, while it may seem on the outside that nothing is changing, I think there are things that are being done in smaller, big ways to change things as well. So maybe a survey around that will also give us a sense of how teachers' well-being are improving. That would be interesting to know. Yeah. Um, I do know
Pratiksha
that.
Shen, sorry,
Sorry.
sorry.
No, I was
So,
going to say both Prema and Nimrat work in this space, so they could help us set up that survey then. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
Pratiksha Shenoy asks, how do we get schools to see that getting a professional to talk about well-being is important? The cost that comes along with it is usually looked down upon as more as an unnecessary expense to them. Good
Right.
question.
Yes. So I think it is important for people in places of power to understand why well-being is important, and that may look like very, very rational things, as that you would get positive academic outcomes, you would get better children. I'm wondering if just modeling it in a way that takes it away from teachers will help us pay more attention to teachers. Because, in some sense, people in power in private schools want excellent results, uh, want more children to join their schools, and in some sense, if making money is central to their agenda, or whatever else is their agenda, for them to understand that, if teacher well-being is not central to it, none of this is sustainable in that sense. None of their agendas can be fulfilled, no matter what it is. While we have to fix the agenda itself, which is another whole conversation, uh, I'm wondering if that will help us look at teacher well-being and well-being itself as an important conversation.
Yeah, again, a nice spate of interesting questions. So this is really turning out to be very interesting. Um, I was just wondering about the survey. If you actually had to go out and do a survey like that, how would you operationalize well-being? What are the things that you would look for? How would you make it? Because this is something that teachers also don't think about really, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's like we discussed, mentioned, talked about right in the beginning, that it's something that's recently come into the discourse, and people like you are bringing it into the discourse around teachers. And
Right.
yes, after COVID, there has been some discussion around teacher well-being, etc. But if actually we had to operationalize the term well-being,
Right.
what are the what I mean? And you mentioned some dimensions. So how would you do? How would you kind of operationalize these?
Right. So well-being is a all-encompassing term, and a Swarbrick is someone who does an excellent job of dividing that into 8 types of well-being in that sense. So there's physical, emotional, intellectual, financial, occupational, environmental, spiritual, all of that. And if we look at each of these, while you can't isolate them and they will overlap and intersect with each other, if we were to understand each of these itself, and say if we were to conduct a survey itself, we'd begin by, say, under physical well-being, understanding just how healthy are you, right? The kind of food you're eating, what kind of nutrition do you have access to, what kind of water are you drinking at school, how much rest are you able to get, what are your just general exhaustion levels, how often do you get a break to sort of rest by yourself, right? That would, and how often can you go for a health checkup? Just things like that would determine your physical well-being. Say, for example, your occupational well-being would include things about what kind of professional development are you able to have, what kind of growth are you able to experience, what kind of peer-to-peer interactions are you able to have, right? So just asking questions under each of these realms will give us also a sense of where we are at and what more can we do to improve it for ourselves. um, like emotional well-being will give us a sense of what is our understanding of not just our emotions, but also how do we respond to different contexts, how do we respond in different relationships. Our social well-being could also tell us how we're interacting with the internet, because it's a huge part of our lives now. What kind of relationships do we have there? How can we tap into it to build a community? How can we use it in a more effective way? Just yeah, some examples there. But I think looking at these 8 dimensions of wellness itself will give us the bigger picture.
How do you see the spiritual dimension? Because I quote you, well-being emerges from nourishing the physical, emotional, cognitive, social, and spiritual dimensions.
Right.
So how do you see that panning out?
So, spiritual well being encompasses our sense of meaning, our sense of purpose, the values that we hold on to. And so, as a teacher itself, to sort of look at what gives me meaning in life. Does teaching as a profession itself give me meaning? What are some values that I have in life? How do those values then dictate my actions as a teacher? What is my sense of purpose, right? How much does the work I do help me attend to that sense of purpose? What more would I like to do to explore these parts of myself? Again, we're not etched in stone, we're constantly evolving. So, is there space for my growth itself in that idea of spiritual well being? Um, yeah,
That is very, very interesting. And based on your responses to some of the questions and your article, of course, I get a sense of there's been more of something that emerges. The well-being will emerge out of a community of teachers rather than just the individual. Am I right in understand in saying that?
I think it's the coming together of the two for sure. Like I've been saying, I think. But do you want to finish your question, Nimrat?
Yeah, yeah, I did. I was just
Oh,
wondering, whether I had completed my question. So
okay, okay.
essentially, whether it's something that the community of teachers coming together will enable this well-being for each other, or whether it's a more individual kind of a pursuit.
Right,
Besides, of course, the fact what we've already discussed, the ecosystem and the school
right,
environment, etc., being conducive to
right.
facilitating this well-being.
Right. So there is both an individual and community aspect of it. Even the World Health Organization, when they describe self care, they talk about it as an endeavor of both individuals and communities to sort of promote the health of a person. And so, while we're taking individual actions to sort of work on ourselves, um, what we mean by a community is a group of teachers being able to come together to share their experiences and identity as a teacher, and to sort of exchange notes, to sort of seek inspiration in each other, and then to hold space, right? While these may include sharing some of our life stories, a community is also knowing boundaries, right? Is to know that you're not taking advantage of somebody just because you know about something that's happening with them, or to be able to practice compassion with them and care with them, and knowing that care does not only mean being lenient, but also knowing that care and compassion also means accountability. It also means being able to disagree with respect, right? And so a community then becomes a place where y'all are like learning together, growing together, and yeah, and thereafter just discussing how you can improve the lives of your children, right, while holding your own lives as important, in some sense.
I think this helps me understand also, and please let me know if I've understood it correctly, if I'm saying it the way you intended it. So, when you have this whole community of teachers working together, when you have a sense of accountability as well, and you mentioned the freedom to do certain things, so teach autonomy piece, you mentioned participation in school processes, etc. So there's a whole while there is a whole culture of care, there is also a sense of accountability, of an understanding of what needs to be done, and a commitment to do it. So that's
Right.
for me the connection between the code of ethical conduct and the well-being of teachers comes together more clearly with
Right.
your answer now. Have I understood it correctly?
Yes, that makes sense. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Because I think when we care in a place, we also know that the other people are influenced by our actions. If we want a move of a deadline, we're aware that we have to show up to that next deadline because it'll affect the work of the other people also involved. And if we can't do it, is there somebody else we can seek help from? So I think all of that is sort of care in some sense. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and that also helps me understand better, how the individual and the community come together.
Right,
Because the
right,
two are so inextricably linked that you can't really say it's either the individual or the community.
right, right.
So,
Yeah,
yeah, and also, Keerthana, I was just thinking this the whole. I'm referring back to the National Education Policy 2020, which is one of which actually emphatically states the importance of school culture. And to start thinking about school culture and its role in well-being, I mean, what comes to your mind?
right. So culture is central, right? And I think that's also one of the things we spoke about earlier, which is that it does come down to the level of schools in terms of the change that actually ends up happening. Um, so culture is part of this culture of care that you mentioned earlier as well, which is which may be as basic as how the school is designed itself. I've offered this, given this example in the article about how we keep chairs in a staff room will determine how much space a teacher has and how much quiet time they can get, right? Things like that also determines a school's culture, right? It clearly tells that they care about the time and space a teacher has. Culture would also mean how two people who have disagreed at a meeting look at each other when they step outside the meeting, right? Are they still carrying grievances from that? Um, Culture would also be how we're able to uh, how we're all able to just work together in a way that is sustainable, that's holistic, and taking into consideration the fact that we're human beings who are trying different things here, and that there is room for error, and then there is room for correction and evolution. So I think all of that in turn then of course contributes to how well a person feels in a place, um, is what I'm thinking.
Right. So I'm hearing the physical environment. I'm hearing relationship between peers.
Right,
I'm uh, hearing about teachers' own emotional. What should I say? The SEL part of it that you talked
right,
about.
right,
What about the relationship between the teachers and the learners? Um, so how do you see that playing out in the teachers' well-being part, and how do you think the school culture can contribute to that?
right. I think the school culture plays a really big role in that. In just in terms of, say, if a teacher has had 3 continuous hours with a group of 10 or 11-year olds, that teacher is exhausted, that teacher is ready to not want to come the next day to school. And that is an aspect of school culture, right? Just how you're designing the timetable to give a teacher time in between classes. While I do understand there may be a teacher shortage, you may need that teacher to be there for 3 hours. Is there a way you can space that out, instead of giving it to them as one big chunk, right? And so then in turn, if that teacher is spending 3 hours in a classroom, uh, they are bound to at some point lose their cool, because being with a group of children is a full-time thing. You need to constantly look out for them, and just pay attention to all these kinds of needs that are existing in a classroom. So just for a teacher to feel healthy and arrive with fullness, it is necessary to have a culture that supports it. Yeah.
There's
Yeah, oh, go ahead.
Yes,
sorry, sorry. Go ahead.
please.
Now, and I was going to say also then, I think the satisfaction a teacher experiences in a classroom, right? If they are feeling like they're able to actually be in a classroom and add value to their children, that itself is a major reinforcement to show up every day and do a good job. And so having resources or support systems that help you nurture your ability to professionally develop also then contribute to your ability to feel well as a teacher, I think. Yeah.
I was just going to ask one question about, in our country particularly, perhaps all the world over, actually admitting to some kind of, burnout or a feeling that you need help, professional help, is sometimes taken to be a sign of weakness, you know. How
Right.
can a school make sure that, and they won't, teachers generally don't admit it to each other. They will not say, I'm really feeling so terrible, I can't go to class today, because it's looked upon as dereliction of duty. Now, how can a teacher, a school create an atmosphere, the heads and everybody create an atmosphere whereby you're able to say, I'm only human, you know. So I'm feeling very down and out today. How can a school do that?
Right. So I think in creating safe spaces, you will be able to be more vulnerable. And creating safe spaces may look like just the kind of language we use with each other, um, just the kind of just the way an authority is imposing their power in a school, right? Also, if people sitting in higher positions may be able to acknowledge their shortcomings or their vulnerabilities or their exhaustion, then that may also create a safe space for people, for teachers themselves to say, hey, if they are sharing, it should be okay for me to share. Also, in a teacher community of say 20 people, there will be one person who may be willing to share. So to just sort of encourage them to sort of kickstart that process and then to help people. Also, just slowly through these meetings, when we do some of these reflective exercises where we create some space for emotions to exist, I think it'll allow for more people to admit to these things. Um, yeah. Also, just I think maybe having one-on-one conversations with teachers, because sometimes in groups it may be difficult to admit these things, but to know that there's a person, say even if not a school leader but a counselor that they can reach out to in a school itself, who can hear them out, then that's also a possibility.
It's interesting, Kirtana, that Prema has this question because I was also thinking of, again, to quote from your article, you say that since the teacher workforce is primarily comprised of women, their gendered view of caregiving may further obscure their thought process. So, I mean, it is expected that women will. I mean, I was just wondering, is my interpretation right that it is
Right.
expected that they will never complain about not being
Right.
well or not feeling good?
Yeah, that is the expectation, right? That women are built with an infinite capacity to give care and love and nurture without ever burning out. But to also just make them aware to say that it's possible for you to stop, to pause, to take time out for yourself is necessary. So just even for them to become aware of their own needs will be important. Um, and on some sense, even for higher authorities to become aware that this needs to change, right? Yeah.
So one quick last question, Kirtana. Um, uh, do you see this? How do you see this playing out in schools where there are very few teachers and very high PTRs, etc.?
Right. So
Do you see the community, or do you see the cluster resource center personnel, etc., supporting the teacher in this context?
definitely. So we would need a cluster resource person to step in to create more space for, say, resources or support systems, or even to see how we can bring in that extra teacher to support them, right? But also to then give these teachers some leverages. Is it possible to give them a few extra leaves? Is it possible to allow teachers to come in a little late on some days, or leave home a little early? Is it possible to make some meetings not mandatory, right? Can you move some things online so that they can go back home, rest for a bit, and then attend it? Just again, if it's possible for them to have a conversation with the teachers to say, what is it that you need that will help you in this situation, um, in the immediate. uh, I think that would be ideal.
Okay. Thank you. Over to you, Prema.
It's been most interesting listening to both of you and hearing how just a little bit of thoughtfulness and care can go such a long way in creating, as you say, a safe atmosphere, a safe environment for teachers to function and for children therefore to grow and learn much better because a good teacher or a happy teacher makes for a happy classroom. We all know that, and I think of our own school days too, we remember the happy teachers much more than the brilliant ones. So, and we remember the sad and rude teachers much more for their rudeness than if they were really brilliant teachers who delivered their classes very well. But we can still recall how terribly scared and afraid we were because the teacher herself wasn't. Now, looking back, now that you're all adults, looking back, because she must have been unwell, or perhaps there was something big going on in her background and we didn't even know about it. And so it's been really lovely to hear Nimrat and Keerthana discuss this all important question of teacher well being and socio emotional well being, because these are terms that have really come into their own, especially after COVID. And I think we should encourage and support such initiatives. Thank you both very, very much for sparing the time and making such an interesting evening for us all. And thank you for to the audience for sparing the time and being here, asking such interesting questions and making it also lively and interactive. Please be here again on the 1st of March for the next installment of LC Live. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.